Hey, how you doing? I hope you're staying healthy and well and safe and getting off to a good start in the summer. Good job on the start on week one for MC304. I appreciate the level of discussion and the kind of discussion that we're having, and I think that's the sort of thing that really makes this class work the best. I mean, you could just read a book and take quizzes, but it's hard to get a lot out of it that way. So the more you guys have a conversation, the more we all learn together. So looking ahead for this week, it's kind of a big week text-wise. We've got 3 chapters to do inside of 1 week, and they're all kind of important. Well, actually, every chapter is important. I mean, because they're always about people. But we've got a lot of content in this week. So there's no paper due this week, but we will have 2 or 3 forum discussions, and you have a quiz over the chapters that you'll be reading. They're chapters 3, 4, and 5. So the way the book works, as you've probably noticed, is the first 2 chapters were kind of general, and then the authors are going to work their way through very specific populations or audiences, starting kind of by race and then gender and orientation and religion and class, and then a wrap up with some other things at the end. So this week we're looking at Native Americans and their representations in the media, African Americans and their representations, and Hispanic Americans. So what I want to do is kind of briefly go over each of those 3 chapters. Now, if we add all of those peoples up, we're looking at a significant portion of the U.S. population. One thing that we know from demographic changes is that the solid white majority is actually changing, and if you pool what would be, I hate air quotes, but if you would pool what would be considered minority populations and put those together, the minority population can become a majority too. So what we're looking at are Native Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. So chapter 3 is about Native Americans. If there is one demographic group that is grossly underrepresented in American media, it would probably be Native Americans. Somewhere in the order of about 1% of representations in the media are of Native Americans at all, much less whether they're really good ones or very, very poor ones. And there's a lot of history there. So you can read through that in the chapter. Some of the things that I think you may want to key into is, for Native Americans, the concept of the noble savage, which is kind of like a compliment and a slam all in one phrase. And again, anytime we reduce an entire group of individuals down to a label, we're probably screwing it up. And we certainly did in Native Americans. Native American tribes and cultures were radically different across the country, different languages, different belief systems, and all that. To try to label it as one thing, even when we say indigenous peoples, they're radically different from coast to coast and north to south. So, we're kind of on a tough spot there right away. But the noble savage character representation was a way for Eurocentric Americans to say, wow, we appreciate that nobility and that closeness to nature and the warrior ethos and all that. But the fact that you hack up white settlers, that's not going to work. So you're a savage because you're probably not Christian, and you're okay with hacking up your enemies and torture and all that. You're dirty, and blah blah blah, and you live in a tent, and okay, you can imagine all of that, right? But there were at the same time these odd things that Eurocentric or European Americans appreciated or valued, and so you get this weird kind of dichotomy, like, we think you're not quite human, but boy, we really admire these things, and it's a very confusing representation. So that's one of the first ones to get across. The other one is when Native Americans are portrayed in the media. First of all, how are they portrayed? And that noble savage thing comes in very strongly there. And second, who is playing that character? And that leads us into a concept called whitewashing. And in whitewashing, we take Caucasian, European descent actors and actresses, and we darken them to be Native Americans or Hispanics or Arabs. So you can find some really egregious, they'd be hilarious if they weren't so awful, examples of whitewashing. And you guys can probably find some in your pop culture. For me, one of the most ridiculous is casting John Wayne, the quintessential American cowboy, as Genghis Khan. Really? You can find them. But this is especially prevalent in representations of Native Americans. We often have white characters who are made up to portray those Native Americans. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some Native American actors or indigenous peoples actors. There are. There are few. And when we see them in the media, we especially go, and this kind of fits back towards the Noble Savage thing a little bit, and it's a way that we can, a lens that we can look at all representations of minorities, is two kind of considerations. One is that they're zoo people, and by that I mean that we want to see and appreciate their ethnic heritage without really seeing them as modern peoples with a place in modern society. For instance, if you think of Native Americans only as wearing their tribal dress and doing tribal dances and speaking their native tongue, then you've kind of reduced them to the way that we would look at an animal in the zoo. That, we put these lions in this exposed area that looks like the savannah, but it's really not. They're just there for spectacle. And so zoo stories or zoo people, that's one way. And the other one is problem people. And this is probably a difficult situation for Native Americans too, because if we do honestly look at their representations, it is either that zoo character or we focus on the poverty and addiction issues that are prevalent in the reservation system. And so you don't really get kind of any normal person perspective on Native Americans. When we do see them, a lot of times they're the sidekick or they're a mystical character or they need white man's help, or right? So you'll see those kind of recurrent characterizations in there. And then, of course, there's the whole question about sports teams and mascots and representations. I don't know if you know this or not, but Southeast Missouri State University, before they were Redhawks, I was an Indian. I was a Southeast Missouri State University Indian. And in fact, that was their view. Now, how did we come to label sports teams as Native Americans, these dirty savages? Well, there must have been something in their ethos that we appreciated, because we sure do use that labeling a lot. All right, chapter 4 is on African Americans. So you'll need a little bit of historical perspective, which with things that are happening in our country right now might not be that hard to actually grab and get a hold of if you're not as familiar with them as maybe you ought to be. So how Africans were brought to Americas, what the slave trade was about economically and as a human rights issue, the 13th Amendment, and then all sorts of different forms of discrimination. So, a lot of this is so current. Another area is the history of film roles and characters for African Americans. There's an awful lot of talk about Gone with the Wind right now, whether we should watch that movie or not watch that movie, and how we should do so, and how Hattie McDaniel was one of the first African Americans to win an Academy Award, and what that meant at that time in Hollywood, etc. You'll want to read through the common motifs we'll see in TV program, both in entertainment and news, and how those have changed to some degree. So if we roll back into the early days of media, I mean, good grief, we can go all the way back to the minstrel shows, and it gets really, really uncomfortable, and work through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and then 80s, 90s, and to today, we're going to see some different trends there, but we're going to see them expressed differently in different forms of media. So we may get one message in entertainment media and then an entirely different perspective in the news. And I think those are both worth looking at right now as well. And we'll also kind of need to look at alternative programming for African Americans. once in the media business side, and I'm not saying that this is good or bad or evil or anything, I'm just saying this is a business reality. In the media business, when you can grow an audience large enough, okay, that you can make exposure to that audience valuable to advertisers, you now have an economic engine to drive media. So in the media business, either the audience or the viewer pays for the content, or more likely, they get to consume the content for free, but it's supported by advertising. And in order for a media business to make enough money, there's got to be a large enough audience there that will interest advertisers. So once that hits, now we can look at developing alternative forms of media that are self-sustaining and do appeal to a non-majority audience. So take a look at that one. Chapter 5, Hispanic Americans. We need to understand that that's kind of a difficult label because the one thing that holds these different cultures together is language, not necessarily ethnicity, and maybe not even what we would consider the demographic look for Hispanics. So that is a label that really refers to the bond of a language, Spanish. But if you look at these Hispanic populations in the U.S., if you're in Florida, it's going to be heavily Cuban. And if you're up on the East Coast a little bit more, it may be more Puerto Rican. And if you are Central and Western, it may be more Mexico, Central and South America in that regard. And while those people all speak Spanish, the language changes, their dialect changes, and there are different cultures. So it's hard, again, to slap one label like this is the Native American representation, this is the African American representation, this is the Hispanic representation. So we're kind of read through that. Stereotyping is something prevalent against all of these minority populations. And what we want to do is to be able to pick those out. We want to be able to recognize and see those pretty quickly because it's a shorthand in storytelling and it's a way to kind of control images and how we perceive things. So if you were looking at African Americans, it might be the mammy role or the athlete role or the mystical Negro or this. There's not all sorts, but there are several prominent stereotypical roles there. And if we look at Hispanic Americans, it's probably things like the sexy Latina, the drug dealer, the lazy guy, right? You can get all these. But we want to be good as media consumers to see that, to pick that out, to know what we're talking about. The same thing, you'll want to be familiar with alternative media for Spanish language and how that is a growing thing. This is actually the fastest growing minority population in the U.S. It's a different language, right? And what kinds of implications are going to have for us as a country? And what kind of implications does that have for media? And what will that mean going ahead? So those are the 3 chapters. Like I said, it's kind of a big week. There's a lot to cover there. So give a read over those chapters. We'll have the forum discussions going on there. If you have questions, shoot me an email. There is going to be a quiz. There wasn't a quiz on the first 2 chapters, but there is on 3, 4, and 5. So be sure that you hit that quiz. The other note I might kind of remind you is the forums are a big driver in this class, and the earlier you get in and the more you participate, the better your grade will be. If you wait till the last thing on Sunday night and you throw in a couple sentences, minimal effort will get a minimal grade. So just understand that that's how I grade those things and what I'm looking for in class. All right, guys, you're doing a good job. Keep it up. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you in the discussions. Stay safe. Be good.